Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friday, February 28th, 2025 episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, a public event with Congressman Randy Feenstra, library bills at a Western Iowa forum, and of course, the big one, Statehouse Republicans vote to remove legal protections for transgender Iowans. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines bureau chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. We got the full roster with us this week. Say hello to Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Hey, Tom.
Hello.
Lead Des Moines Bureau Chief Maya Marchel Hoff is with us. Hello, Maya.
Happy Friday, Erin.
Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times is here. Hello, Sarah.
Greetings, Erin.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal is back with us. Hello, Jared.
Good morning, Erin.
And rounding it out is Gazette columnist Todd Dorman. Hello, Todd.
Hello, Erin.
All right. A lot to get to again this week, so let's jump right into it. We must, of course, again start with the Republican-backed legislation that would remove gender identity from the Iowa Civil Rights Act. It was, without a doubt, a momentous week at the Iowa Capitol, and it peaked on Thursday when the bill was debated on the floor of both chambers and passed by both of those chambers on Republican support. I said this in the On Iowa Politics newsletter, which you all should already be subscribed to. The spectacle that day at the Capitol rivals any of the other biggest days I've covered in my 14 years on the State House beat. And I was talking to another colleague who's been around even longer than me, and we came up with the same 2 days when they passed the abortion restrictions in during 2023 during the special session, and when they passed the collective bargaining changes back in 2017 for public employees. Those were the only two that I think this day even holds a candle to. And I don't know that I'd rank those three. They were all pretty amazing spectacles, but this one was right there with it. I should also note, for bookkeeping procedures, we are recording the podcast almost midday on Friday, and we are waiting to see at this point whether Governor Kim Reynolds will sign the bill into law. We very much expected her to. It would be altogether shocking if she didn't, but we're just watching for that official word again as of around midday Friday. Todd, let's have you kick this one off again this week. You wrote a column about the bill this week. Maybe give us a little snippet of what was in there. And I'm just curious, as you watched this process unfold through the week, a very quick and nimble legislative process, I might add. Did your view of any of this change as this all unfolded?
No, well, yeah, sort of. I mean, I thought it was a horrendous bill the first time it was released, and the fact that they got it passed in just a matter of days sort of adds insult to injury. And I don't think anybody affected by this bill felt like they were at all listened to or given a chance to, have any type of input on it. And my view of the work product of this legislature and others has been pretty dim, but I think this time we're talking about maybe some dying embers in the middle of the fire. That's how dim it's become. You said that those were two loud moments, the abortion ban and the gender identity bill. Iowans don't like their rights taken away, and that's why they clog the Capitol when it happens, and it's happened too often in the Capitol over the last several years. And so it doesn't surprise me that they came and yelled and even swore. I mean, it was just their, lives and existence at stake. Nothing, no big deal. But yeah, I've said a million times what I think of the bill. I think it's going to be I think that day is going to be a pretty dark day in Iowa history someday. Maybe not today, because today the supporters are touting all of the things that they've touted, which I think a lot of them are suspend disbelief, but they've got the votes.
Yeah. Tom, I mentioned that quick and nimble legislative process. Todd just alluded to it too. The bill was passed by both chambers of the Iowa legislature exactly 1 week after it was introduced. So pretty significant legislation for the reasons Todd outlined, and from bill introduction to passed by both chambers of the legislature was exactly 1 week. Pretty expedited process, and that in no small part is what made for a pretty incredible week at the Iowa Capitol. You were obviously there for it all. Were there any moments that stood out to you this week as you covered this story?
I guess the biggest thing that stood out to me is that businesses that have previously spoken out on previous efforts to remove gender identity from the Civil Rights Act remained silent this year. So when and a shout out and a kudos to Stephen Gruber Miller from the Des Moines Register, who wrote an article on this. I think it was yesterday or earlier in the week. Pointed out that when former Iowa Governor Chet Culver, a Democrat, signed the law adding gender identity and sexual orientation to the Civil Rights Act in 2007, he did it at Principal Financial Group's offices in downtown Des Moines. And large companies like Principal and business organizations like the Iowa Chamber Alliance, the Iowa Business Council, and the Greater Des Moines Partnership have previously registered in opposition to similar bills, similar efforts removing gender identity as a protected class, but did not register in opposition this year. It is worth noting that the Iowa Chamber Alliance did register on the bills this year, but they registered undecided. So in previous years, they had registered in opposition. This year, they just registered undecided. Earlier today, I talked to Dustin Miller from the Iowa Chamber Alliance to ask him about this. And he said that they didn't have a push from its membership this year to register in opposition to it. He said that there were, questions or differing, perspectives by its membership about what the bill would actually do. And he mentioned that, the difference this year compared to previous years was, in the past with transgender bathroom bills and in RFRA that have been passed in previous states like North Carolina, you saw more concern from membership because there were direct threats at that time. The NCAA said that if you pass RFRA or if you pass, these transgender bathroom bills, that we will pull regional NCAA tournaments from your state. And so there was a concern from the business community that the NCAA will, pull tournaments from Des Moines, and that, that has a tangible impact to Iowa's business community. And so, he said, absent kind of a direct threat, from passing this bill, this piece of legislation, there, just wasn't that same level of, concern as in years past from Iowa's business community. And then there were also questions about the impact that that removing gender ID from Iowa Civil Rights Act would have with regard to employment and the workplace, and questions about protections that are provided on the federal level from Supreme Court cases and Federal Civil Rights Act versus what Iowa would do at the state level with this bill. But we've heard some backlash from LGBTQ rights groups, who are disheartened, to say the least, about the business community, kind of in their view or their words, sending on the sideline this year. So LGBTQ rights organization One Iowa said that they feel that the Iowa business community has abdicated their responsibility to Iowans and that they are being, quote, penny wise and pound foolish with their own workforce. And, again, in the past, we've seen businesses speak out on these efforts and the concerns about the impact that will have on Iowa's workforce, in that it'll only exacerbate the workforce issues and challenges right now that we're seeing in the state, and only make it harder for Iowa employers to attract and retain world-class talent in Iowa. And saying that it seems like either those workforce concerns no longer exist, which I don't think anybody would agree, or LGBTQ people are just no longer a priority for their workforce. And went on to say that if businesses think that they can try and play neutral in this fight and just not say anything and that nobody will notice. Keenan Crow from One Iowa told me, I assure you LGBTQ Iowans notice, and that their dollars and their attention will be redirected accordingly.
Yeah, and forgive me if you did say it, Tom, but just in case you didn't, for anybody who might not be familiar with the acronym, RFRA is the Religious Freedom
Yeah,
Act.
sorry,
Yep,
right.
Yep. And Maya, you covered Thursday's debate in the Iowa House. I was up in the rarefied air of the low oxygen Senate gallery. You were in the House there, and there was one particular moment, I think it's safe to say a particularly powerful moment, when Representative Amy Wichtendahl, a Democrat from Hiawatha, who is the state's first transgender state legislator, spoke during that debate in the House. Describe that scene, if you could, for us.
Yeah, definitely. Before Representative Wichtendahl got up and gave a statement on the floor, as expected, a lot of House Democrats said their piece and voiced their strong opposition to the bill and listed many different reasons. Some questioned Representative Steve Holt, who had been the floor manager of the bill, who had been the sponsor of the bill in the House. But I think intentionally, Representative Wichtendahl was the last person to speak before it went to a vote and before it went to closing statements to Representative Holt. And like, as you mentioned, she's the first openly transgender member of the Iowa legislature. And it's safe to say that you could definitely probably have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor of the chamber at that moment. It was, usually when lawmakers are giving statements on the floor and speeches, a lot are either on their phones or on their laptop, kind of doing other business. But almost everyone, it was looking up, even, a ton of Republicans. And she just kind of talked about her experience and as a transgender person in the state, and kind of gave a rebuttal to a lot of statements that were made about trans people. Representative Holt had talked about how they make a lot of women feel unsafe, whether it's public restrooms or locker rooms. And Representative Wichtendahl just highlighted her experience and how this legislation would go beyond just solidifying those laws that lawmakers had passed in the past few years around bathrooms and women's sports. She talked about an experience where she had faced housing discrimination, where she had gotten a notice from her apartment, when her son was very young, and she talked about that. And she said when the legislature put gender identity into the Iowa Civil Rights Act, she was relieved, and that it genuinely helped with securing housing for her, maintaining employment, just having those types of protections. And she said that transitioning saved her life. And there were tears. It was very emotional. And then afterwards, a lot of lawmakers stood up and clapped. It lasted about 30 seconds, if not longer. And I was talking with you, Erin, about that yesterday, of whether that's common or not. And you mentioned that that's typically not allowed for lawmakers to clap or kind of react after they give speeches. So, and then one quote that kind of stuck out was, she said, "This bill revokes protections to our jobs, our homes, and our ability to access credit. In other words, it deprives us of our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I bring this up because the purpose of this bill and the purpose of every anti-trans bill is to further erase us from public life and to stigmatize our existence." So,
yeah, to that, it's the applause at the end. I was struck by that too, as someone who's been around there for a while. To be clear, it's not allowed, period, during debate. That goes against the rules of decorum. And so for that to not only have happened, but for it to go along as long as it did, and I give credit to Speaker Grassley. Now, look, I can hear the people yelling at their radios and at their YouTubes now. I know that it's the folks who oppose this bill aren't probably comfortable giving Speaker Grassley too much credit for anything given the bill that passed. I'm acknowledging that. I'm just saying in that moment, you know, the Speaker has the authority to squelch that and bang the gavel, and that's not allowed. And just, I guess, surprising to me that he let it go on as long as he did before gaveling back then. He kind of allowed that to happen. Like I said, to the folks who would say so, I understand that that's a very, very, very minor victory in an otherwise tough week. I'm just saying, in that moment, that was pretty remarkable.
Something I was curious about with this. So part of the rationale for passing the bill was that, which you guys had in your story, was that transgender protections in the Civil Rights Act, quote, endangered state laws passed in recent years that banned, gender transition care for minors, all those other laws that are passed. So my question then is, doesn't that kind of retroactively call into question the legality of those past pieces of legislation?
I mean, I agree that that's a fair question, and if I was sitting across the interview table from someone talking about those bills, that's exactly a question I've had that I've had that exact same reaction. Jared's like, that doesn't. I don't know that that's. I know the argument they're making, but I don't know that they're hearing that argument fully. It's kind of an admission, like, we know that we wrote unconstitutional laws, so we have to change the law. But I guess they would push back and say, well, the only reason it's unconstitutional is because gender identity is in the Civil Rights Act, and so therefore we don't think it should be.
Yeah, and then the other thing I was curious about was your guys' story mentioned that, among other things, the bill, if it's signed, would state that the term equal does not mean same or identical, and that separate accommodations are not inherently unequal, which you guys noted echoes the 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which declared segregation on the basis of race to be legal. Did any legislator address that parallel at all?
I mean, Democrats obviously did.
Right.
And Representative Ross Wilburn, a Democrat from Ames, brought that up during subcommittee and committee meetings. In terms of Republican lawmakers, they felt that language was needed to make clear that separate accommodations for sexes, separating the sexes for bathrooms and locker rooms, and providing what they say are safe spaces for the sexes, that doesn't violate somebody's civil rights protections, that separate but equal accommodations for different sexes, for male and female, are allowed, are permissible, and that is not a violation of equal protection statutes.
I think we should get rid of freedom to flourish and replace the motto with separate but equal. So I think that would be, I would send a great message.
That'll look good on a TV spot.
Yeah.
I was just
Sure.
gonna chime in. First of all, it's just remarkable to me how quickly this issue has changed in politics. I mean, just the adage that all politics is local and now all politics is national just really seems to be exemplified with this, because I remember covering lawmaker here, Luana Stoltenberg, who, when she announced and she said that was one thing that she supported, was like removing this protection for gender identity in the Civil Rights Act. And I had just like never heard a lawmaker take that stance before. And so then to now, 2.5 or so years later, that actually is like passed through the legislature. And then I wanted to note the 5 Republicans that voted no on it. One of those is in kind of our area in Scott County, Norland Mumpson. So I called him this morning and and asked him about his vote. And he just said, he had a real short answer. He just said, "I'm against discrimination for anybody. It's just that simple."
Interesting. He was one of the ones. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sarah, because he was on that list. Like there were very few surprises. Like it made sense when I read, Brian Losey and now I'm blanking on some of the other ones, but they're very much in the classic mold of the more centrist Republicans, and Norland was one of the ones I was curious about. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's awesome.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say it's interesting though. He said he supported the banning transgender girls and women from girls and women's sports, and didn't agree with the he worded it like, "I don't agree with the whole bathroom thing," I think is how he worded it. But he said he just wasn't comfortable with taking away rights like that.
We talked earlier about how quickly this kind of moved through the legislature, and I was talking with a friend of mine who actually works in the legislature down in Missouri, and he was amazed when I told him what the time frame for this was, that it was introduced last week and has already passed both chambers.
They can be nimble when so motivated. The legislative process moves very slowly until it doesn't.
Yep.
Yeah, gender identity might not even be in the Civil Rights Code if it wasn't for Republicans. The House at that time, Democrats controlled it, but they only had 50 yes votes. One of their members was serving in Iraq, and so they were stuck at 50, and 9 Republicans voted for it and delivered the 51st vote they needed. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was a trifecta for Democrats, but it wasn't. They still needed help, and there were, I think, overall 9 House members and 4 senators voted in favor, or voted.
Okay.
Did any
Democrats vote against that? Todd,
yeah, there were a couple sort of kind of these things that animals that don't exist anymore. They were kind of Democratic, conservative, rural folks, and there were 2 of them. I think they had a 54-46 majority. So
yeah. That's fascinating stuff. And Jared, back to your point, but some of those questions you raised, I appreciate that, because obviously this has the top line element to it with gender ID and the Civil Rights Act, but the bill does a lot more than just that. So I appreciate you raising that, Jared. And I would encourage anyone listening, if you've kind of just focused on that part of the bill as you followed this throughout the week, please go back and find one of our stories and read it all the way through and see all the other things that this bill does, because it's as big as that is, it's more than just that.
Yeah, some of those other things that you guys kind of bulleted out, those seem to be the places where there's going to be the most litigation going forward. Yeah,
pretty easy to see that. I'm not a forecaster, but by nature, but pretty easy to see that. And again, speaking of forecasting, and again, I'll book in this again highlighting that we're taping this midday Friday. So depending on when you're listening to the podcast, either we'll still be waiting for Governor Reynolds' decision, or it may already be signed into to law. We'll obviously be watching that in the coming hours and days, and could have something to talk about again next week to bring that full circle in to 2 whole weeks. All right. Moving on to tangentially related to the Iowa Capitol, but taking place out in Western Iowa. Our Jared McNett covered a legislative forum at which a debate over bills on library policy broke out. And Jared, we've been covering this. Tom and Maya know what we're talking about here, but this was kind of interesting. Tell us about what happened out there.
So yeah, this past Saturday, the 22nd, I covered a forum that was hosted by the League of Women Voters, and it featured Iowa House Republicans, Iowa House Reps Bob Henderson, who is a Republican, and J.D. Scholten, who of course is a Democrat. None of the other legislators from our area made it, and over the course of the hour and a half that they talked, there was a lot that came up. The transgender legislation, of course. Property taxes got talked about. Doge got talked about. There's a whole lot. But the thing that was most interesting to me was the discussion about Iowa House File 274, which would repeal a section of Iowa Code that says that nothing in the state's obscenity laws prohibits the use of appropriate materials for educational purposes in accredited schools, public libraries, or educational programs for minors. And so there were 2 different questions on the matter. One of them was from Helen Rigdon, who serves as the director of the Sioux City Public Library. She said she thought the legislature is targeting public libraries, and she called out Representative Henderson for what she said were false comments about seeing pornographic material at a local library. Representative Henderson said he hadn't been to that particular library in 15 years. So that was a funny kind of back and forth about whether or not somebody was at a library. Representative Henderson then said that his understanding of the bill is that it tells libraries that they have to provide areas that are restricted to underage children without parental approval. And then Helen Rigdon, the director for the Sioux City Public Library, pressed him on that, and she pressed him on why the state needs to intervene in a discussion of parental guidance. And Representative Henderson said, quote, parents should be able to do what parents have done quite a bit, which is to put their trust in agencies to protect them. So that was the first kind of back and forth on the matter. And then the other person who spoke on the matter was Susan Stewart, who, in addition to listening to this podcast and writing a regular column for the Journal, has served in the past as a chair of the Woodbury County GOP. And she made clear that she was there as a citizen and nothing else. But she expressed concern to Henderson and to Scholten that smaller communities might opt out of supporting public libraries entirely because they could prove to be more trouble than they're worth if this legislation were to become law. And Representative Henderson kind of said that part of the reason for the legislation is that teachers or personnel have allegedly shifted obscene materials to public libraries because they have immunity from being sued for pornography. He didn't provide any examples of that, but that was his assertion that that's going on. And so that might also be part of the reason this bill needs to happen. And then Scholten, who actually shouted out our podcast at the forum. So that was funny to be there and hear someone in an answer on the record mention hearing something on our podcast and then speaking on that issue. He pushed back on Representative Henderson and said that people all across the state, regardless of party, agree that the legislation involving libraries goes too far.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm always interested to hear those tells from those. First of all, credit to Representatives Scholten and Henderson for attending those forums. I feel like they're dying off. So credit to them for participating. And I'm always interested to hear stories about discussions like that out there. And yeah, we've heard talk about that bill. And there's another one that would withhold state funding from a specific program to libraries if they're part of the American Library Association, which people have become critics of as supporters of libraries. And sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Am I correct? Did I see that somebody called it the Marxist American Library Association?
Godless Marxists. I was at that subcommittee, and yes, there was a woman at a subcommittee hearing on the bill who referred to the American Library Association as godless Marxists.
So interesting times. Sorry, did you have something, Maya?
Yeah, interesting part about that. The president-elect of the ALA is actually an Iowan.
Sam Helmick, right?
Yeah. So, and she was at, I don't know, I wasn't at the House subcommittee like you were, Tom, but she spoke at the Senate subcommittee for a companion bill. And she's like, I'm a conservative, I'm a registered Republican. So if that gives you any context, but it is really interesting that the president of the ALA or the president-elect is actually an Iowan.
Always an Iowa angle. Speaking of town halls, want to wrap? Well, first of all, Jared, let me really quick. We're not going to talk about it, but I want to highlight. You mentioned Doge. You also have a really interesting story that we're just not going to.
I was ready to talk about that. I was going to work it in.
Yeah, I know.
I'm a craftsman.
We're going to get back to it next. If we don't here yet, we're going to get to that next week because that's a really interesting story too. Folks, go read it in the meantime. But I want to talk about that on the podcast. So if we don't get to it this week, I promise next week. But speaking of town halls, Western Iowa Congressman Randy Feenstra held a public event that our Jared McNett covered. I don't know if it was necessarily purely town hall, Jared. You can tell me when we get there. But it's obviously an interesting time to be in Congress, especially when you come back home for the weekend. There are, I think it's safe and accurate to say, some feelings out there about President Donald Trump's new administration thus far. Even in more conservative areas, we've seen some town halls and some conservative southern states getting pretty animated in recent weeks. So, Jared, how was the event with Congressman Feenstra? And first of all, was it like pure town hall or was it something else?
So it was open to the public, and we made sure to write about it ahead of time in case people were interested to go. But it was mostly kind of, business leaders and other community leaders, not necessarily, at least from what I saw, not a lot of just average Joe Schmo types there. Okay. It was at the Chamber of Commerce, so that kind of gives you some context too. No. But yeah, at the event, Feenstra said, among other things, that the public doesn't hear enough about the good things that the Elon Musk guided Doge is doing in the second Trump administration. One of the quotes from Feenstra that's in my story was, when you start looking at government as a whole, it's massive. What Doge is trying to say is, how can we be more effective, more efficient? We get worried about what's happening when we hear about the bad stuff. We don't hear about the good stuff. Now, one of the things that's been discussed as the bad stuff was there were workers for the USDA who were working on the bird flu outbreak, and they were laid off. And then the federal government later tried to rehire some of those workers, and it's kind of unclear how successful that was. In other parts of the federal government, like some of the people in charge of nuclear materials were laid off. And I know I'd seen reporting about that they had trouble tracking those people back down too. So it's unclear how many of those bird flu people are even back. But Feenstra said the bird flu researchers getting caught up in the cuts wasn't appropriate. And he said, some of these things happen with a new administration, and if you have concern, please come to me. So that message kind of differed a little bit from the message about hearing too much about the bad stuff that Doge is doing. And, of course, bird flu is a big deal in Iowa since we're the top egg state. So, and just in Northwest Iowa over the past 3 months, there's been more than 1 million chickens that have been culled because of the bird flu. So, new administration and everything, but you can't really afford to have oopsies on these kinds of things if you're a producer or someone relying on, poultry for your living.
Yep. Well, and let's tie them together, Jared, then, because if Congressman Feenstra was talking about Doge and trying to put a spin on it, you have another story that you reported recently that there's some bad news on that front in the congressman's district, right?
Yes. So the Sioux City IRS office appears to be one of more than 110 locations across the country that are on the chopping block. And that's based off of reporting that we looked at from the Washington Post and Newsweek, and then the Doge website itself. The Sioux City IRS office, which is like an assistance center, it appears on the Doge website and is said to amount to a total savings of $17,364. Some keyboard warriors on Facebook have been telling us that that number is low and that we're putting out propaganda, but that's what's on the website, and they can go look at doge.gov for themselves. And I've actually linked to it in the comments on our Facebook. So if you're hearing this, check it out for yourselves. Don't just believe little old
hold
me.
on. You're reporting the literal Doge numbers and then getting accused of underselling
Of
Doge?
Propaganda, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. Just wanted to say that a second time to make sure we were clear.
I'm sorry. Did I hear you correctly? Did you say $17,000?
Correct. And then there's also listed a leased cost or a lease cost of $104,000, but that is not the total savings on the thing. Says $17,634. So there's that one.
At least it didn't say 17 million first and then get corrected to 17,000.
I've been by where that IRS office is. There's no way it would cost anywhere near that. And then the other thing on the wall of receipts on the Doge website is an entry for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Sioux City. And for that one, Doge listed a total savings of $126,664. No one complained about that total on Facebook. So we made up one of them, I guess, but not the other. And on the Doge website, it said that the annual lease cost there is $217,000. So those are the figures for the attorney's office. We reached out to the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Iowa, which is based in Cedar Rapids, the main office. And one of the U.S. attorneys, Tim Duax, told us yesterday that the Sioux City office was aware of the listing on Doge, but had no further comment. And then a public information officer for the district told us that I can't say much other than to refer you to Doge. So those were the official comments we got on the matter.
Fantastic. Myself in trouble.
Oh my God.
This whole discussion got me thinking about public appearances, and as Jared described, it wasn't pure town hall, but at least it was a public appearance. It was open to the public, and those kind of activities seem to be going the way of the dodo too. Sarah, has Eastern Iowa Congresswoman Marinette Miller Meeks been doing many town halls or other similar kind of public appearances?
No, she hasn't done any town halls. I was scrolling through her social media here this morning, and it looks like she's done some events like private tours of businesses or organizations. She spoke to the North Scott Rotary. So nothing that like press or the public has been notified of widely. So she hasn't had any town halls. Similar to the ones that Feenstra has held. So yeah. And then going back to the Doge thing, we saw Jared's story and we were like, well, we should see if there's any in the Quad Cities. And there was something, and so we're doing some reporting on it. So we don't have any like official confirmation, but just looking at the Doge website, there's something in the federal building on 4th Street, the Department of there's like a Department of Labor office in there. It's like multiple federal agencies operate out of there. And so there was like a $7,000 savings cost for an office.
Are you sure that's how much it was, Sarah? Do we know for sure that it was $7,000?
Yeah, I mean, that's according to the Doge website. And then there was also a relocation. And then across the river in Illinois, there was listed a relocation of an ICE office that they said they moved their office, and that was going to save like about $170,000. And now I'm quoting from memory, so please don't come at me if I didn't get that quite right. So there is some in the Quad Cities as well.
But these savings, what we don't realize is that these numbers don't mean anything, because these are all Bitcoins, and so this stuff is worth millions in, Bitcoin
What
currency.
What happens to these values, Todd, if there's no gold at Fort Knox?
Well, yeah, if there's no
Is
gold
that-
in Fort Knox, I think that's a bigger deal. But I'm just waiting for the $250 bill to come out so I can get my Trump $250 bill with his picture on the front.
And the $5,000, is it $5,000 Doge rebate that we're all getting, or 500? What, I can't even remember what it was.
Yeah, maybe it'll be in those $250 bills. That would be
Yeah.
that would be
There you
swell.
go.
It better not be in pennies. I'll tell you that.
That's true. Or that's how they get rid of them.
Yeah. Just send us each Amazon sends us a 50-pound box of pennies.
Oh man.
Just to jump in really quickly about Representative Marionette Miller Meeks. I do believe she did a telephone town hall.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
In the last couple of weeks. But yeah, hasn't done anything in person from what I can tell.
Now, and how do those work, Tom? Are those moderated as far as who gets to ping in and ask a question, or how does that work?
I mean, yeah, it's a more controlled environment, right? I don't know that I've actually ever listened in or called into a town hall with Congresswoman Miller Meeks. I have in the past for ones done by Ashley Hinson, so I can tell you how those have been conducted by Ashley Hinson's office, but I can't really speak to how it's been done in the past by Congresswoman Miller Meeks.
And speaking of, now that you mentioned that, Congresswoman Hinson has done some public events, right? Like I feel like I see a public schedule. I don't know how open public they are, I guess I should say. Do you know, Tom, off the top of your head?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't, just because I've been so wrapped up in the legislative in the legislative session. But I know that, in general, in the past, as other members of Iowa's congressional delegation do, they regularly tour every county in their district. But as Sarah noted, these are largely, private tours that they're doing, and they may invite press along. And Congresswoman Hinson often does that. Press is invited along, and then she'll take questions from them, after the tour or after the event, or she'll do like a round table, and we'll invite press to sit in and listen to the discussion, and then take questions afterward. It doesn't seem like, at least in this situation, at least in recent weeks, or at least the last 2 months, that Congresswoman Miller Meeks is doing that. It seems like she's going to these rotaries and these groups and these private functions, but she's not inviting press along, and not allowing press to ask questions, or allow the public to ask questions.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, Tom, because I forgot about the town hall. She said in a recent newsletter that more than 15,000 people joined her call.
Nice.
That was February 3rd.
That's almost as many weekly listeners as we have for the On Iowa Politics podcast. Everyone believe that? Yeah, I think everyone's buying it. All right, good. All right, that's it for this week's episode. By the way, thanks for sticking with us. Read all our coverage from the week. It was a crazy week, and talked about at the Capitol. Jared's got some great stories. We just talked about all that stuff. Please find us. And then everybody, if you're on YouTube right now watching us, lock your eyes right now on Maya and Tom's screen as I talk about next week. We'll come back and talk about Funnel Week. All right, that's it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice. We're on, again, YouTube, where you should smash that like button. You can also find the podcast each week on your preferred Gazette or Lead newspaper website. Clicks are good too. Now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, please make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And again, don't forget the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs, Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For Tom Barton, Maya Marchel, Hoff, Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Todd Dorman, and our producer, Becky Gardner, I'm Erin Murphy. Be well, everyone, and be good.